Welcome to another edition of Forecast Lab, the only channel that uses genuine Weather Service forecast charts. Not this one, this is digital atmosphere, but shortly we're going to go into the AWIPS graphics, and those are always interesting to look at. Anyway, yeah, we've got quite a bit of weather going on in the south central U.S. Blowing dust around Lubbock, snow from Denver down to Raton and up into Kansas, and a lot of cold air advection flowing into northern Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. Let's start out with the eastern U.S. We've got a warm front moving up through New York into Rhode Island, and we've got that deep southerly flow, and that's starting to bring some moisture into the southeastern U.S. Dew points into the 60s, basically south of this green line. So that's going to be the 60-degree isodrosotherm trailing back into Florida, and then we've got some 65 about like that, and probably 70 off the coast. And as we know, when there's a front to the west and moisture is flowing north, that can set the stage for thunderstorms. Anyway, let's take a quick look up in the northeastern U.S. Looks like fair skies through much of that region. A little bit of cirrus moving across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Temperatures have risen quite a bit, up to 56 at Albany and up to 65 at Poughkeepsie, and some 70s have been popping up in Maryland. In the southeastern U.S., we can see that moisture flowing onshore, picking up cloud streets where we get that strong heating over the landmass, and that forms these cloud streets that you see oriented from south to north. And that is the moisture coming up north, and obviously some sort of boundary right through here. Nothing really apparent on the surface chart, so that could be some sort of little mid-level boundary. And then we move out to Texas in proximity to that strong weather system. That's marked by a Canadian front coming south, a low-pressure area around Amarillo, a dry line extending south, and some sort of Pacific system probably running about like that. And you can see the dust being picked up right there in the Lubbock area. Winds have been quite gusty, up to 62 miles an hour at Amherst and 60 miles an hour at Tatum. And I'll show you a bit of what happened yesterday. A strong disturbance dropping out of Colorado, and you're going to want to watch this area here. This is yesterday about 10 a.m. We roll that forward. You can see that dust being picked up around Canadian down to Shamrock and entering Oklahoma there. Oklahoma City is located about right here, and yeah, plenty of that dust all the way down towards Wichita Falls and Ardmore. And that's what it looked like about during the overnight hours. Obviously, we're not going to see this on infrared. But you can see what happened to the air quality last night in Oklahoma City. That's going to be dusk right here, and you can see the dust hit right around dark and hung around during the overnight hours, and only finally this morning did things improve. Now, while the weather action is certainly up in this region, if we move south, we pick up some very warm conditions. 95 degrees at Del Rio, 92 at Laredo, and look at these dew points. I don't think I've seen them quite that low in the Mexican Plateau region. That's minus 15 at Durango and minus 11 at Torreon. And yeah, let's run the high split model to see where that air came from. And we're looking at the air that reached Torreon. It appears it has a trajectory from western Canada, and it also descended from higher altitudes. So that's going to be dry air. Looking closer at Texas and the Rio Grande region, you can see all these 80s here. That appears to delineate the extent of the continental tropical air mass. And somewhere in here, we pick up that Pacific front. Temperatures drop off into the 70s. And you can see Van Horn there with some cool conditions. They're a little bit up in the mountains, not very much, but they've got that northwesterly flow, temperatures of 57, and it cools down significantly at El Paso. They're down to 45 right now. And if we go up into New Mexico, yeah, they've had some travel problems in that area. 1.3 miles. It says fog, but I would bet that that is blowing snow. Quarter-mile visibility at Dalhart in heavy snow, and snow all the way back into the Four Corners region. This is not a great picture, but this is Capulan Volcano in northeastern New Mexico. Some bad road conditions there a few hours ago. There's Raton Pass along Interstate 25. That's on the Colorado-New Mexico border. Don't see any cars on the road there. And the roads in New Mexico have been looking pretty bad in the northern part of the state. Lots of problems along Interstate 25, Santa Fe, anywhere north of Albuquerque. And we haven't really done cross-sections in a while. This might be a good opportunity to go from this cold air mass in Nevada, cross it around where that blowing dust is, and end up out there in the Gulf where we have warm conditions. So obviously we're going to transect that dry line, that cold front, and the jet. Do you see the thickness pattern right there? That packing of thickness contours, that's going to approximate where the polar front jet is, basically running from Baja California all the way up towards Indianapolis. So let's drop a cross-section in that zone right there. So there's what we're looking at right now on the NEM model. This is going to be about 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We can see the Canadian front working south. The dry line, well, that's not going to show up very much with this potential temperature. That's more a function of dew point, so I'm not going to try to find that. But the Pacific front is going to run about like that. Probably a warm front right around Terlingua and down maybe as a cold front, kind of like that. So let's do that transect through here. And here I've set up the line. You can see we go from E right around Las Vegas to just off the Texas coast. And there it is. We're looking at a cross-section from Las Vegas, right here, all the way to the Gulf. In between, this is going to be the area around El Paso. And you can see the terrain rising up near the Continental Divide and then descending down towards the Gulf. And we can also pick out the tropopause and the front. If you look at those pink lines, that's the color I'm using for potential temperature, and the tropopause runs about like that, naturally higher in the warm air. And then the front itself, that's going to be it right there. Looks like it comes down to the surface just east of Kermit. That's going to be somewhere around maybe Midland. So we can see that there's not a whole lot of potential temperature difference on the horizontal near the surface, but once you get above 10,000 feet, up to about 600, 500 millibars, yeah, it definitely shows up. And I've got some green lines in here indicating the flow into the page by the jet stream. And that's focused on this area right above the front. It appears there's another segment right up here. That's going to be over central Texas. And we see some strong winds coming down to the surface right about here. That's going to be some momentum coming down and helping to kick up that dust in West Texas. Now I realize that some of you may be confused what these red lines are. Potential temperature is basically what would happen if you grab the air at a specific level, like right here, that's 400 millibars, that's about 15,000 feet, and you forced it down to 1,000 millibars, which is near sea level pressure, or near sea level. So you're going to get that adiabatic warming. Obviously, it's about minus 20 degrees up there. But if you get that compressional heating, that adiabatic heating, it's going to warm up over 100 degrees. So we got these values in Kelvin, 320. What is that in Celsius? Well, you just subtract 273, and that'll give you about 47 Celsius, which is about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So certainly it's going to be quite warm if you push that to the surface. So what might make a little bit more sense is if you compare it side to side rather than up and down. Let's look along that line that I just drew. We've got higher values right here, 314 over central Texas, and cooler values out in Arizona. Now, if you go horizontally like that, that's going to pretty much approximate the air temperature. So we can see that that is cooler air compared to warmer air. Same thing between here and here. Warm air, cold air. And the same thing from here to here. There's warm air in this region here. It's kind of like a little pocket. And then it goes to cold, a little bit cooler, over East Texas, and a little bit cooler out towards El Paso. And that's that wedge of desert plateau air behind the dry line. So we can pick out the front, which is about like that, and we can also sort of pick out the dry line. And we can sort of see the capping inversion. Not very well, but where you have packing in the vertical, like right here, you don't need to worry about why, but that's an indication of an inversion. So that's a little capping inversion at about 5,000 feet. So if you go vertically, a little bit of packing right there, yeah, that's an inversion. That's a frontal inversion. What about up here? That's an inversion too. That's the stratospheric inversion. That's basically the air up in the stratosphere. Pretty much everything above that line right there. And where the lines are far apart, that's a good indicator of high static instability, where you have steep lapse rates. So steep lapse rates in here with strong winds indicated by those green 80 to 85 knot winds, that's a good recipe for bringing that air down to the surface and kicking up that dust. And this is slightly different. I added in specific humidity, which is basically a measure of the moisture in the air. Now you can use dew point, but I prefer specific humidity in plots like this because it's biased towards rich values of moisture, so you're not wasting your time looking at patterns where you have dry air. So what we have here is the tropical air. That's it right there, beneath that capping inversion. And we can pick out the dry line. This is a good product for picking out the dry line. So that's going to be located about in here. And then we've got that capping inversion. That's the top of the tropical air mass. It appears there's some residual moisture over East Texas and Louisiana. The boundary on that is about like that. And everything in this region here, that's going to be part of the elevated mix layer, which is basically the continental tropical air and where it exists aloft. And I'll write that out, EML. And then, of course, we've got the cold front and the tropopause. And then back in here, we've got that maritime polar air mass coming in from the west. So that's your little tutorial on cross-sections. And we'll try to look at more of these as we get into storm season. The northern plains also contending with that storm system, mostly in the form of snow. Winds are out of the north, temperatures in the teens. They got 2 inches of new snow at Denver, 6 inches in Boulder, and about a foot in the foothills. Looking at about 1 to 3 inches of new snow in southwestern Nebraska, mostly south of Interstate 80, and those bands are making it all the way into Hastings. And we've also got that outgoing system there in Ontario that passed through Minnesota and Iowa and South Dakota last night. Blizzard conditions in that region. 25% of the county in Big Stone County, Minnesota, is reportedly without power. And there's a look a few hours ago looking south on Interstate 29 in northeastern South Dakota. Drifting snow. And that's another look right there in South Dakota. And the snow totals have shaped up like this. Not a whole lot of snow, 1 to 2 inches, but it has been blowing around. And there's a look at the snow in Denver just a few hours ago. Some beautiful scenery several hours ago in Utah. That's Bryce Canyon, where they picked up 5 inches of new snow for a total of 29 inches on the ground. Roads are closed through Capitol Reef National Park and in Zion Canyon due to ice and snow. And that's it right there. Still another disturbance working out of the area, and some snow has been reported all the way back into the mountains north of Los Angeles. And there it is, early this morning, snowfield along Interstate 5, and also some snow in the mountains east of Riverside. And as we go forward through the afternoon, we get that heating, and a lot of it just disappears. Heading up north into the Pacific Northwest, haven't heard much of anything out of that part of the country. However, next week they will be getting quite a bit of weather. We're going to cover that momentarily. A weak system off the British Columbia coast. Alaska looking rather stagnant, not much going on, a little low. Down around Yakutat, and just kind of a weak cyclonic flow around that system. The usual Arctic air in the Northwest Territories. Looking around for the coldest temperatures. I guess that's going to be minus 36. I think that's minus 26. Okay. Scratch that. I think it's going to be minus 38. Right there. I guess that's Jenny Lind Island. Not sure what station that is. Minus 30s all the way down towards Churchill. That's going to be about minus 30. And then, yeah, some very cold air going all the way into Manitoba. And there's yesterday's weather system trekking on through Ontario and Quebec. But it brought a rather large fetch of warm air. We talked about that earlier in the northeastern U.S., but that extends all the way into Quebec, and a lot of the precipitation up there is in the form of rain. And some record heat extending from southern Saudi Arabia into India. Yep, a cold season heat wave. These are some of the temperatures at 12Z, up to 95 degrees in southern Saudi Arabia, 90s through southern Iran, and we've got a 99-degree reading at that station, wherever that is, and plenty of 90s throughout western India. We are in the midst of a sudden stratospheric warming episode. We're going up to 100,000 feet, the 10 millibar level, and you can see the temperatures here vary from about minus 70 across the British Isles up to about minus 15 across northern Russia. And this is the evolution over the next few days or so, going into next week. You can see that area of warm air kind of spreads into the northern hemisphere, and that's associated with an anticyclone that's centered across northern Russia into Alaska. And this is an unusual pattern. What we should be seeing is this large polar vortex centered on the North Pole. Well, the North Pole is located right here. So it's being split by this cyclone and this anticyclone right here over the Chukchi Sea. So that's a high, and this is a low. So that anticyclone has put much of the U.S. under easterly flow up there at 100,000 feet. And running that forward, we see that that anticyclone displaces the polar vortex, which ends up shrinking a little bit, kind of disappears there into Russia. And at this point, we're kind of near the peak of that anticyclone. This is the weekend. And then moving forward, it appears the anticyclone starts weakening some, and the polar vortex over Russia tries to move back into the polar regions once again. Now, what effect does this have on the surface? Well, not a whole lot. We usually have to wait for these things to play out, but it does tend to put North America under a negative NAO pattern, which means the flow, instead of going across the Atlantic like that, which tends to confine the Arctic air masses up north, it tends to weaken. And when that happens, the polar air can move south a little bit more easily. So assuming that happens, that's not going to be an instantaneous thing. We would probably have to wait until March for some of those effects to play out. But I've not really seen much evidence of a major sudden stratospheric warming event. If we go to 50 millibars up at about 70,000 feet, in fact, what I see here is just a large cyclonic polar vortex. Not so much over North America. It is kind of broken up into eddies. However, I would expect to see some propagation of that anticyclone downward towards the 50 millibar level, and I'm not really seeing that. Now, I'm not really an expert on middle atmospheric dynamics, If you have any perspectives or any observations, feel free to post in comments. So let's go ahead and return to the troposphere. Now this may or may not be related, but we take a look at the patterns up north, 300 millibars up at about 30,000 feet, and we see a tendency for a ridging in Alaska over the next week or two. Let's run that forward. We start out with that jet stream well to the south of Alaska, out there in the Gulf of Alaska. Winds relatively weak, on average about 20 to 30 knots in northern Canada. But as we go forward into the 20th and 21st, we see that ridging really build across Alaska there. The flow strengthens and becomes more northerly across the Canadian Arctic, and we pick up some good jet stream energy, up to about 100 knots there in northwestern Canada. And this has the potential to displace quite a bit of polar air southward. We'll have to see how that plays out, but that could bring some cold air south, at least into southern Canada, and possibly into the northern U.S., maybe towards the final days of February. And plenty of weather at the current hour. A dust storm from La Mesa, Post, all the way up to Childress, Turkey, and Guthrie. Let's take a look at the weather this evening in Texas, Oklahoma, and out into the southeastern U.S. Well, an enhanced risk for the rest of the night in Arkansas up to Memphis, and we've got a severe thunderstorm watch box out for the Texoma region. And for tomorrow, an enhanced risk from Jacksonville, Mississippi, all the way up towards Cincinnati. And here's a quick look at the thermodynamics and the pressure field. This is for the current time. There's the cold air, the Pacific air moving out into West Texas. The front, about like that, the dry line somewhere in here, and the Canadian front about like that. So moving forward, the NEM model has that front moving out into East Texas, and I put the deformation field on here. That's the shading, which tends to outline the front a little bit. So certainly a wave, indicating low pressure there around Fort Smith. So I don't know if we have enough moisture up north, but if we did, that would be an enhanced area of possible severe weather in the Branson, Ozark area. But again, I'm not sure we're going to have it that far north. Anyway, the cold front will be sweeping a lot of that forcing into Louisiana. This is going to be around 6 a.m., probably a line of storms with that, at least initially elevated. And then as the day goes on, that will propagate eastward into Mississippi, Louisiana, and out towards Nashville. And behind it, the potential temperature in pink showing the cold air advection sweeping into much of the south-central U.S. And here's a look at the dew points in green and the radar forecast. So at 0Z, which is about 6 p.m., not much going on yet, but you can definitely pick out that dry line right there. And another little lobe of the dry line down towards Laredo. And then things start moving east, and by this time the cold front is probably caught up with the dry line. And so we just get forcing along that boundary. This is about midnight. Yeah, some thunderstorms around Fort Smith, and there could be the potential for some severe weather up north. Again, I'm just kind of guessing here, but the flow is a little bit backed in that region, so that would bear closer scrutiny. Things move eastward, and then we get more forcing out ahead. This is going to be about 3 in the morning. That's probably the main cold front right there. And then things start organizing about dawn. We get the heating, and then we get that window of severe weather around midday from western Tennessee down to Mississippi, and possibly some more cells further up north in Kentucky. And that's how things play out. That's about 9 in the evening, and then we get up towards Friday morning, and things are out near Georgia and the Carolinas by that time. Now, one thing that did catch my eye, you probably remember we were talking about that dry air in Mexico. This is 850 millibars. This is up at about 5,000 feet. We're looking at the dew points in Celsius. And I'm going to take that forward. And you notice by the time we get up to tomorrow evening, we got this band of minus 20 dew points up at 850 millibars. And it gets even drier as we get into Saturday and Sunday. Look at that. Lots of minus 30s and minus 40s dew points through that region. That's very, very dry air just above the surface. So if there was a mile-high skyscraper out there at Memphis or Little Rock, you would definitely be feeling some of that dry air up near the top. That's likely not going to come down to the surface or anything like that, but it will help provide the potential for some very cold nights, I would think at the very least, and some very clear air, probably great for astronomy. And that's all I got for this edition of Forecast Lab. Just as a reminder, we are funded by our Patreon donors. We do not run ads on this channel, so if you want to keep it that way, please consider being a Patreon supporter. Hope you all have a great Wednesday evening. Take care, and we'll see you back here in a couple days. Bye-bye.